yes, you're in charge of the company, but you basically have given yourself a job. And if that company can't go significantly grow and become something more than creating you a job, even a high-paying job, I don't think that's the goal of a business. The goal of creating a business is not to give yourself a job. Hi, welcome to another episode of Baktari MD. And again, this season, we're going to be talking about Crash CEO School. And by that, I mean we're going to go over the fundamentals of leadership so you can go to the top of an organization and lead it like a pro. A lot of the skills we've been talking about this season really involves trial and error. But if you incorporate some of the strategies we've talked about this season, you may be able to bypass some of that trial and error and anticipate problems in terms of providing amazing leadership. Today, what I want to talk about is selecting the business if you haven't started it and what you should think about in choosing and selecting a business. I think a lot of people, when they decide to start a company, often stumble onto it gradually. In other words, something happens, they get an idea, they look into it more, they meet someone, they find a partner, and that's all great and good and sort of organically starting a company because of some prior knowledge of a service or a product, some other experience. Maybe you work for an insurance company, so now you want to start your own insurance company. You work for a landscaping company, so now you want to start landscaping. That's all very organic. And I think that's amazing that that is organic, but I think it has a drawback. And the drawback is this. Often we select the company we want to start because of something like I just said, which is you worked for a landscaping company, you worked there for 4 or 5 years, and then you said, well, gee golly, I have all this knowledge and information, why don't I go start my own landscaping company? Which is fine. But were it not for that, would you have selected that business? In other words, let's look at selecting your business from a different set of filters. Obviously, it helps to have worked in a landscaping company in this example because you are going to be able to understand the industry, blah, blah, blah. But if you reverse engineer it, you're probably much better off in researching the pros and cons of certain industries and then going out and getting experience and using that experience to start your own company. Because just because you answered an ad in Indeed and got a job at an accounting company or a finance company doesn't necessarily mean that's probably the best field in 2023, 2024. It just means that you happen to be in that industry, or somehow you happen to have a hobby that led you to invent something. But I want to look at selecting a company in a much different way, which is when you think of what business to start, you have to say, forget about whether I have certain talents, whatever. Is this a good industry to be in? Because if you simply go from being in a landscaping company, working in a landscaping company, to being the head of a landscaping company, if all you've done is given yourself another job, yes, you're in charge of the company, but you basically have given yourself a job. And if that company can't go significantly grow and become something more than creating you a job, even a high-paying job, I don't think that's the goal of a business. The goal of creating a business is not to give yourself a job. The goal of a business is to come up with something that's going to, exceed your wild expectations in the long term and change your life in ways that you haven't dreamt about. And so in selecting a business that you want to start, it's very important to say, other than the fact that I happen to be in this business or I have this inside track, is this something I would have thought of just generically? Is this a good industry right now? What's the competition like? What are the margins? Are the margins going up? Are the margins going down? Is this a field that there'll be even more demand in the future? And I don't know if everyone thinks about it like that. They think about it, well, I just happen to be, into stamp collecting, so I'm going to open up a stamp collecting website. I get that, but just the fact that you have an inside track on it doesn't mean that that industry is the right industry in terms of growth, margins, and advances. So if you reverse engineer it, what you really want to do is create a company that, after a lot of thought, is going to be the kind of company that, if you do everything right, makes your competitions irrelevant. You're not struggling for margins, and you're not in a blue ocean. You're not in a red ocean where you're stealing clients from one company to your company. I think I talked about in my previous videos that great book called Blue Ocean Strategies, where you want to create a company where really your competitors are irrelevant. And I think that's really the filter someone should use in creating a company. So if you're going to be the 10th accounting firm in a small to medium-sized company, by definition, you're going to be in a red ocean where you're, for the most part, going to be, stealing clients from one accounting firm to another, which is fine, and you can make a living on it. But it just doesn't have that endless potential if you come up with an idea or a company that is, in many ways, doesn't really have competition. Whether it's because of technology, because you've created the space, because you have some inside track on something.
Why hasn't getting a simple laboratory test been as easy as ordering something online? Well, now it is! With 3 simple steps on eNationalTesting.com, you can have your laboratory test ordered, go in for testing the same day, and get your results quickly, right to your email. eNational Testing is fast, convenient, and confidential. Begin taking charge of your health today with eNational Testing's complete healthcare panels and easy-to-understand results at over 2,000 locations nationwide. No matter who you are, where you are in the United States, or what your health concerns are, eNational Testing is your comprehensive resource for laboratory testing services. It's time to focus on yourself. Let us do the hard work for you. eNational Testing. Easy, convenient, and tailored to your health needs.
This leads me to another point. When I tell this to people, I think a lot of people say, well, yes, but you know what? We're going to start the 10th accounting firm, but we're going to provide greater customer service, or, we're going to work longer hours, or what have you. Customer service you need. If you don't have customer service, whatever business you're in, if you don't have great customer service, it's not going to work. Having said that, you can't build the business because you're going to provide great customer service, because that's not a barrier to entry for other people to come into your industry and match your customer service. I'm not saying they will or won't, but the goal is not to necessarily say, oh, I'm going to get into a very crowded field, but I'm going to outmarket, or I'm going to out-hustle, or I'm going to just provide better customer service. I know a lot of people do that, and I know it works. But it's really not looking at the odds, a highly likely thing to work. And when you hear businesses failing, often it's because they decided to be, the 10th restaurant in a block that has, a bunch of restaurants. Yes, it can work. You could theoretically be successful, but statistically, you won't, and statistically you want to set your company up in a way that has the maximal chance for success. And there's no arguing that your chances for having a successful company will be exponentially higher if you don't have any relevant competition, if you are in a space that you've created, if you created a product or service that nobody else has, or nobody else has that technology. And so there's a big wall that separates new businesses that either are just basically replicating other people's business models with tweaks versus coming up with a business model that essentially creates its own space or has its own product or its own technology. So I think rather than succumbing to this thing that, well, I just happen to be good because of my experience, so I'm going to go into that field, don't let that impact what field you choose to go in. Now, don't get me wrong. If you are going to go in the field, it helps to have 5 years experience, working in the field. I'm not minimizing that, but that should not be the driver for how you pick that business to start. Because just because you happen to, be in that industry or know a lot about that from your hobby or whatever, you may be very good at crafts or whatever, but opening a craft store may or may not make sense, and certainly it's not the kind of thing where you can say, my competition is irrelevant. Now, I think so, to get to my earlier point, I think a lot of people fool themselves in saying, well, I know more than the next guy. I'm going to provide better customer service. Again, that could work, but we're talking about maximizing your chance that you'll be successful. And if you want to maximize your chance to be successful, look hard at whether you can come up with something that really makes your competitors irrelevant, right? If your competitors are irrelevant and you basically control that portion of the market, whether it's in your town, whether it's nationally, I think it's going to give you a lot more flexibility. And what you're going to wind up doing in the long term is not just giving you a job, but giving you something that potentially has really no limits to where it can grow if you really have figured out a way to get to that. So obviously this is easier said than done, because if it was so easy, everybody would just do it. Who would open up another restaurant when there's so many restaurants? Who would open up another accounting firm? Who would open up another car wash? Who would open up another gas station? I get that. So plenty of people are going to do that. But if you want to maximize your chance for success, and you don't want to just create a job for yourself, sit down. Don't pick what business you're going into necessarily because you have a background in it or you have some insight, if that makes sense. So just to wrap it up there, so think long and hard about starting a business. Think of ways that you can start a business where your competitors are really irrelevant, because if you do that, you can do a lot of amazing things with pricing and revenue models that will give you a lot more flexibility. And of course, as we all know, a lot of businesses fail because they're trying to provide great customer service, be there, be responsive, hire people that will take care of the clients, but then they also want to match the other people in their industry or come close or be on the lower end of it. And then, of course, that starts a vicious cycle where you run out of cash. So the best way to do it, if possible, is not to do that, not to create a company where you're just another shark in the water, stealing clients from other people, trying to lower your prices to attract even more, and then it starts this vicious cycle. So create a company that makes your competitors irrelevant. I know that's a big ask, but it's a lot better starting in that position than being another fish in the ocean trying to eat someone else's lunch. I hope that helps. If you like content like this, please comment, like, and subscribe, and we will see you on the next video. Thank you so much.